evening and welcome to a special edition of the News Today. 5 years ago today, a humiliated fruit vendor in Tunisia set himself on fire. Mohamed Bouazizi's act of defiance sparked a wave of popular uprisings throughout the region. The tectonic geopolitical shifts that followed collectively became known as the Arab Spring. But for many, the hope that marked the period has been replaced by despair. There's no better example than in Syria, where hundreds of thousands have been killed and millions more injured or displaced. And yet the carnage there not only continues but has intensified, with world powers unable to bridge their differences. I-24 News correspondent Shai Ben-Ari takes a closer look at Syria, which for many is a microcosm of what went wrong with the Arab Spring.
The mass protests of the Arab Spring, which began 5 years ago today, sparked a chain reaction that has reshaped the Middle East, for better or for worse. Within months, dictatorial regimes were overthrown in Tunisia and Libya. President Hosni Mubarak was deposed in Egypt, and civil war erupted in Syria. Many of the Middle East's national borders, which stemmed from the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 between colonial powers, have been called into question as the region's people increasingly turn towards tribal and ethnic sources of identity. While U.S. President Barack Obama backed the protests as they were occurring, his administration over time has lessened American involvement in the region, but is one international presence, which some view as colonial in nature, being replaced with another. Over the past 3 months, Russia has directly intervened in the Syrian civil war, openly stating it is protecting its own interests in aiding its ally in Damascus.
We said long ago that we will carry out our airstrikes in support of the offensives of the Syrian army. And we do so long as the Syrian army continues with them.
Syria was one of the main issues Russian President Vladimir Putin addressed in his annual press conference Thursday. Many see Russia's new role in the Middle Eastern country as part of an attempt by Moscow to expand its sphere of influence, drawing comparisons to Soviet foreign policy in Asia during the Cold War. While Russian support for Bashar al-Assad is clear, Moscow has been conveying conflicting messages concerning its support for moderate Syrian opposition groups, or lack thereof.
We have established contact with the people who are members of the so-called opposition, which is not the radical armed opposition in Syria, and which first wants to fight ISIS, and is actually already doing this.
Moscow says it has conducted airstrikes in support of the little-known Ghanim rebel group. But even the Russians seem confused over its exact affiliation, with one general noting the group was part of the Free Syrian Army, while the Ministry of Defense claimed the Ghanim unit belongs to the Syrian Democratic Forces, a separate organization. As regards an actual solution to the Syrian crisis, Putin's statements may have surprised some.
I repeat once again that there is no other solution to the problem except for the political one. Do we have a plan? Yes, we do. In principle, it coincides in key points, strange as it may seem, with the vision suggested by the United States.
Putin also addressed the question of Russia's long-term presence in Syria, seeming to rule it out.
Now we have caliber missiles with a range of 1,500 kilometers. And we also have the CH-101 missiles on planes with a range of 4,500 kilometers. Why do we need a permanent base there? If we need to reach anyone, we can do that anyway.
For the time being, however, with violence ongoing, this foreign intervention looks set to continue.
Yes, and let's begin by delving into Syria a little more deeply. With me in the studio tonight are Avi Melamed, Head of Intelligence and Middle Eastern Affairs at the Eisenhower Institute. Good evening.
Good evening.
And Avi Sakharov, Senior Middle East Analyst. Good evening.
Good evening, Ayman.
Well, Avi, let's begin by looking at Syria. 5 years ago, there seemed to be a huge sense of euphoria that democracy is finally coming to the Middle East, that things will change dramatically from now on. Looking back, as we saw in the report, the country is ravaged by war. Bashar al-Assad is still in power, which is not the case in all of the other countries that experienced the Arab Spring. What did we miss when we looked at Syria back then that we know now?
Well, we expected some kind of an Syrian spring, just like what happened in the countries around Syria. We expected the fall of the president, just like happened in other places like Egypt and Libya and Yemen. They had a president and they fell. At the end of the day, we didn't see the way the division between the Alawites and the Sunnis and the way that Bashar al-Assad, together with the Iranians and Hezbollah, are going to hold on Syria as if it was their last resort and not to let go, even in the price of killing of more than 250,000 Syrians. Meaning, while with other presidents, they understood pretty quickly in Tunisia and Egypt that they need to let go and leave in order not to lead for a civil war, Bashar al-Assad didn't care. He was ready to pay the price of the life of hundreds of thousands of Syrians, but all the time that he will stay in power.
Well, that's certainly a point I want to expand on a little more. Let's bring in Aboud Dandashi, a Syrian journalist. He's now in Istanbul, Turkey, and he joins us from there. Aboud, good evening to you. Aboud, we know that Syria has descended to extreme violence. Similar effects of the Arab Spring happened, although in other Arab countries, but Syria is an extreme case. It deteriorated to far more dramatic measures. Why do you think Syria is so much worse off 5 years later?
Oh, that's a good question. I think by now anybody realizes that if you're going to change a regime, change a system, you have to have something really in its place. I mean, when we went out to demonstrate, our slogan was free from Harriet. The problem was that none of us had even lived in a democracy. It was poorly defined what alternative vision was being offered besides the regime. Syria was never going to be resolved militarily. It was always going to have been resolved politically, and there was never a political movement, national movement, to replace the regime. I mean, it's even the most morally bankrupt, incompetent, corrupt, and unpopular incumbent can stay in power if there is nothing available to replace them. I mean, even if you're on the deck of the Titanic, you don't jump off the Titanic unless you know that there's a lifeboat or another ship coming to save.
Well, speaking of jumping off the Titanic, which is a fantastic metaphor, we just heard Avi Sakharov tell us a few points about Bashar al-Assad. We know that U.S. and Russia have opposing views on his future. Russia wants the people of Syria, it says, to decide on who would rule them. In your view, what do the Syrian people want? Because it seems that Western powers tell us what they want. Is this truly what they want? Is Assad what the Syrian people want?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. His own rank and file are deserting him to run over Europe. His military forces, such as they are completely dependent on Iranians and mercenaries and Hezbollah terrorists. I mean, if every single foreign fighter left Syria, from both sides, by the way, from those foreign fighters who are fighting on the regime side and the rebel side, if they all left Syria, this would be over within a month. Bashar would not last. He's totally dependent on Iran and Russia and Hezbollah. The thing is that when Russia says that Bashar can be part of the political transition, that is ludicrous. That is absolutely ludicrous. I've said it before. When the Berlin Wall fell, and democracy swept through Europe, the first thing that happened, first prerequisite for democracy, was that the old regimes be swept away, either be deposed or they stood down. That is the only way that a new democratic society can take root, when the old order is no longer there to impede it. And that's exactly the situation that we have in Syria. The regime is an impediment. And how much longer will the entire region have to pay the cost for Bashar al-Assad maintaining his position?
Yes. How much longer is exactly a question we want to continue talking about tonight. Aboud Dandashi joining us from Istanbul. Thank you very much for that. Avi Melamed, how much longer? Because some people tell us that Bashar al-Assad is part of the solution. He has to be part of the solution. Is it so?
A couple of observations regarding the war in Syria. You know, sometimes people are still calling it a civil war. It's not a civil war. The war in Syria is actually different wars that are taking place in the same time. First of all, it's an open collision between the Arab Sunni world and Iran. Second, it's a collision between the rebels, the Syrian rebels, and between Assad regime. Third, there is already ongoing collision between the rebels in Syria and ISIS in Syria, because they have different visions regarding Syria's future. And fourth, following the Russian involvement in Syria, it becomes also a Russian Western powers kind of like collision. Let's make a couple of, I think, basic observations following what I said right now. 5 years ago, the big boss in Syria, in the end of the day, was the Iranian regime, not anymore. The Iranian regime today, with Hezbollah, with Assad, are in their back to the wall. And basically what they're trying to do is desperately trying to save whatever remain. Remember, Assad today controls something like maybe 20% of Syria. One of the things that people are talking in that context is the establishment of what people call Alawistan, a kind of like a Syrian Alawite entity. Alawite are the minority that rule Syria. Assad is one of the Alawite families, by the way, not the biggest one. And one of the ideas is that the Iranians, Assad, the Hezbollah will try to establish kind of like an Alawistan in the western part of Syria. In the end of the day, when you try to look at this probability, this possibility, it's almost impossible. In the end of the day, what we see today, Iran, Assad, Hezbollah axis in Syria are with their back to the wall. They are losing. This is a battle that they are losing. The Russian involvement in Syria is something that the Iranians are not so very much happy with. And ironically speaking, if such an Alawistan entity is going to be established, the only thing that will stand between them and between the revengeful Sunni Syrians in Syria will be Russia, and ironically speaking, the Arab Sunni state like Saudi Arabia and Turkey that could restrain the Syrian Sunnis from taking revenge.
Which brings us exactly to the next dramatic point here in the debate. What caused Russia to enter this bloody conflict this year, the worst year possibly in the Syrian conflict since it started out? Why now? Why is Putin getting involved there now?
I think that Putin was kind of euphoric, kind of too much sure of himself, of his power to change the equation in Syria.
Kind of like Western powers were when the Arab Spring just started out as we began the conversation tonight?
Maybe, kind of, yeah. Putin decided to send his troops, the aerial troops, of course, the aircrafts to bomb Syrian opposition members and ISIS members and etc., etc. He didn't think that it will be so hard and so difficult. He was sure that together with Hezbollah and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards is going to beat ISIS pretty easily, together then again with the other opposition groups that are not like ISIS, some of them affiliated with Al-Qaeda, some of them moderate and pragmatist.
Similar to maybe Bush's notion when he invaded Iraq.
Yes, but in bottom line, with Iran, it's very interesting. We see them right now withdrawing from Syria, just like it was reported in Bloomberg, with their tail between their feet, running away, understanding that they're going to spill the blood of more and more and more Iranians, not only Syrians. And every day we see in the Iranian newspapers all kinds of announcements about the death of this soldier and this officer, and it became the Syrian mud for the Iranian regime.
Well, I want to bring us now to the country that we started out with, Tunisia. Tunisia is maybe the only example of a successful story about the Arab Spring. If we look back now, we see that Western powers did have some role in supporting the democratic moves that happened in Tunisia since then, since the outset of the Arab Spring 5 years ago. What role can the West play in continuing to support Tunisia on its way to holding up, keeping up this democracy?
I wouldn't exaggerate with the role of the West. Look, Tunisia is an interesting story because there were already a Western-affiliated strong powers in Tunisia. By the way, recently there has been a political crisis in Tunisia because Nida Tunis, which is the ruling party that beat the Muslim Brotherhood party in the recent elections, Nida al-Tunis and Nahda in the elections, there was kind of like a political crisis within Nida Tunis, which is the civil society affiliated political factors in Tunisia. Tunisia traditionally has already, I wouldn't say Western affiliated, but civil society affiliated factors. So looking at Tunisia specifically, yes, it's a great example to see one of the places in the Middle East where political Islam, mostly Muslim Brotherhood, have been defeated. The defeat of Muslim Brotherhood, political Islam in Tunisia, as well as in Jordan, as well as in Egypt, as well as in Kuwait, is an outcome of an ideological crisis that political Islam, Muslim Brotherhood have been experiencing, because ironically speaking, the worst thing that happened to Muslim Brotherhood following the events of the Arab Spring was that they came to power. Because once they came to power in Tunisia and Egypt, they realized they have been placed in a place that they had never been before. It's called the driver's seat. When you sit in the driver's seat, you cannot any longer just satisfied with the slogans of the Muslim Brotherhood, Islam, al-Islam al-Hal, Islam is the solution. You must come forward with solutions, because what's the essence of the Arab awakening? The Arab awakening, or the Arab Spring, some people call it the Arab winter, is the outcry of dozens of millions of people in the Arab societies that are demanding real answers for real problems. medical solution, employment opportunities, housing solutions, running water and electricity and security and so forth and so on. It has nothing to do with Israel. It has nothing to do with Palestinians. And when you come to power and you are incapable to provide people with the answers, you are not going to stay longer. That's exactly what happened to the Muslim Brotherhood in Tunisia. That's exactly what happened to them in Egypt. By the way, Muslim Brotherhood today are in a deep crisis. They are at a crossroads. They have to reevaluate the way. Personally, I predict that the more pragmatic camp within the Muslim Brotherhood is going to have the upper hand, because the more, I would say, observant radical camp within the Muslim Brotherhood can either turn into the Salafi groups, or, even if they want to the more extreme Salafi jihadist groups. But this is a different story.
Well, we're going to talk more about Tunisia and delve into it a little more now and bring in a voice from Tunisia. And Avi Melamed, you are staying with me for this section. Avi Sakharov, Senior Middle East Analyst, thank you very much for being with us. Now, let's bring in a voice from Tunisia. We're joined from Tunis by Ilyas Azzine, founder of the Tunisian Institute for Democracy and Development. Good evening to you, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you for this opportunity to talk about this important issue.
Well, Mr. Azzine, we've been discussing this in the studio tonight. Tunisia is often considered as the Arab Spring's only success story. Do you agree that it is?
Yes, for sure. We are very proud and happy about our revolution and the transition that the Arab region know now with the Arab Spring.
And yet, we also see a major trend in Tunisia of recruitment into the Islamic State. How do you explain that disparity?
It's a delicate issue, because we think that our revolution is a revolution for dignity, it's a revolution for democracy, it's a revolution for social justice. But with this problem of ISIS and this problem of youth people from Tunisia who join Syria and join extremism and terrorism, it's something that come when the state are fragile. And we think also because the exclusion and because the unsuccessful public policy that we manage from the independence until now, that we have vulnerable groups, vulnerable cities, and vulnerable regions. And this is why that we have the revolution.
Yes, I want to pick up on your point on public policy. Let's look at the general atmosphere in the country now. Would you say that the focus is on social issues like corruption and unemployment, or is it still security and terrorism?
It's both. We can't success our revolution and we can't success our democratic transition without both. We have now a good constitution. We success the deal of the political and civil transition. We are now facing the social and economic problem. The employment rate of people with diploma are higher now. We have 1 million unemployment people. We have problem of social and economic policy. We are facing also corruption, and we try to manage a good system of governance and integrity at national level.
And finally, Mr. Azzine, you founded the Institute for Democracy and Development. Do you think democracy is possible in other countries in the Middle East, or that Tunisia is just an exception?
I think Tunisia is the exception. Tunisia, with his modern history of stability, with his modern history of a new elite that they can provide women rights, and we can provide some real achievement in youth rights and women rights. This is the Tunisia exception. But we think also that democracy without development, without economic, social, culture development, without democracy development in the region, without decentralization, without really good inclusion and good participation at local and regional level, we can't success the deal. We are in trouble region. We are our border with ISIS, our border with some terrorists, and we must first face all this extremism and these challenges with the social cohesion and with reforms, courageous reforms that really help people to be implicated in the future of the Tunisia.
Yes, Ilyas Azzine joining us from Tunis in Tunisia. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you for this opportunity, and we hope the best for Tunisia and all over the world.
Yes, and joining myself and Avi Melamed in the studio tonight is Yitzhak Levanon, former Israeli ambassador to Egypt. Good evening.
Good evening.
Well, we just discussed Tunisia at length. Another country that has seen major shifts in power is, of course, Egypt. Since Mubarak was ousted, the Muslim Brotherhood rose to power for about a year. Now al-Sisi's rule is, in many people's views, replicating the same rule that happened before the Arab Spring, the same rule that was in place then. Is a democratic change truly possible in Egypt, looking back 5 years later?
Well, look, if it's possible or not, this is a question that Egypt has been asking itself, for a long period of time, including, some countries in the world, because they would like to see really a democratic system in Egypt. But, we have to understand one thing. When we're talking about democracy in Egypt, this is a huge country. This is not Tunisia. We're talking about 90 million people. And I still remember, Mubarak in one of the meetings, he said, do you think it's easy to control 90 million people? And I believe him. It's difficult, to control 90 million people when you have different approaches, different political views, and basically the same economic and social problems for everybody, whether you are rich or you are poor in Egypt. So it is difficult to speak in terms of changing or shifting in 24 hours from a situation of today to a democratic system. Nonetheless, I think that at the beginning of what they call it the Arab Spring, but in Egypt they don't like to call it Arab Spring, they call it just revolution, the Thawra, or they call it the Lotus. But basically this is the revolution of 2011. This is how the Egyptian like to call it. I was there. The youngsters who went into the streets, they were genuine, they were authentic Egyptian nationalists, meaning they wanted less persecution, they wanted more transparency, they wanted more human rights, freedom of speech, more, to be different than a coercive country or an autocratic regime or persecuting the people. They were genuine, they were authentic. The problem was, at that time, and it is still the situation today, those secular liberal people, they were more divided than united. And this is how we saw immediately a political vacuum, which the only organized people, which are the Muslim Brotherhood, penetrated, and this is how they capture the power. Today, everybody in Egypt, they think, they say, they express this, they hide it, but they feel it. It is going back to the old regime of Hosni Mubarak, meaning a coercive system, meaning an autocratic system. It is the same. Yes, they went through 3 stages: the presidency election, the People's Assembly, and the drafting a new constitution. But if this means that Egypt today is a democratic like England or the United States, I cannot say that.
Well, Avi, the major point that Mr. Levanon just mentioned is the young people. They were the driving force behind the Arab Spring or the revolution in Egypt, and they really symbolized all this movement throughout Arab countries altogether. If we look at the case of Yemen, it's a very severe case. People are saying it will fare off maybe similar or worse than Syria in the end. Where were the young people there? Where are they now? What do we know about the popular movement in Yemen when it comes to the younger generation?
The young people in Yemen are mostly busy fighting. This is the history of Yemen in the last 50 years, more or less. It's a constant fighting. A small remark before we move to talk about Yemen. We have to remember something about Egypt. Recently, there have been elections to the parliament. The participation was very low. It basically indicates that majority of the Egyptians understand that they don't have really an alternative that come forward, and I'm going and emphasizing what I said again. It's about the demands of hundreds of millions of people in the Arab states for real problems, for real answers for the real problems. The same story was in Egypt as well, and I totally agree with Mr. Levanon. It was not about the Islamists. It was these people that basically initiated that, and then the Islamists took advantage of their very high structure capacities. Going back to Yemen. Yemen is a short story, and to make a long story short in Yemen, it's an ongoing battle. It's an ongoing violence. If you look at the history of Yemen in the last 50, 60 years, it's about conflict. The interesting thing about Yemen is today, Yemen become one of the 8 arenas of the direct Iranian-Arab struggle. the Houthi tribes in Yemen, the Shiite Houthi tribes in Yemen, in the northern part of Yemen, who committed a coup in September 2014, backed by the Iranians, are now engaged in a fight against an Arab military coalition. By the way, the ramification of the war in Yemen will have a substantial impact on what's going on in Syria and other places in the Middle East.
Well, let's go to Yemen right now and see a voice from there. Nisma Al-Ozabi, a human rights activist, joins us from Aden. Nisma, good evening. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Nisma, we know that the country is not only seeing airstrikes, but also human rights are continuing to worsen. We know that the movement of food and medical aid to the affected areas is very restricted. Talk us through the human rights situation in Yemen over these past 5 years.
Well, the past 5 years were very difficult for Yemen and many people. Yemen was about to settle down somehow we were about to get a new constitution, but unfortunately the rebel Houthi militia decided that maybe it's not the time for us to settle down. Now, for the past 5 years, there have been, we have gotten through a war, a revolution, changing of presidents, and any kind of rights you can imagine have been violated during the revolution of 2011, and during this war, the situation has come far worse.
Yes, Nisma, what role do you think the international community has in ensuring human rights in Yemen as a human rights activist?
Well, the international community must support Geneva talks, because this war is not doing any good for anyone. Wars do not lead to solutions. Negotiations lead to solutions. We need a serious legal part agree on, and this war ends. I think after that will be better.
Yes. Thank you, Nisma. We have a little trouble hearing you there, but thank you for joining us from Aden. Mr. Lebanon, just briefly, we have less than 1 minute left. People criticized Israel for not doing something when the Arab Spring started. Looking back now, was Israel had the right idea not to do anything at all?
I think it was the best decision taken ever from any government in Israel not to intervene. This is not our business. This is something local. We have to watch it, definitely, because they are our neighbors. But this is something which do not belong to any internal or external foreign policy of Israel. By the way, if you are looking about the youngsters in Yemen, in Syria, etc., you have them. They are all in the social media. You have them there, and they are still existing, and they are chatting between themselves. And this is a hope.
Well, at this point, I'm glad we're ending with hope. So Yitzhak Lebanon and Avi Melamed, thank you very much for being with me this evening.